Something very strange happens when you time travel in One Piece, a phenomena of which we have had multiple examples. You may think that it's just Kozuki Toki's devil fruit, but time travel and time manipulation was actually a well-explored aspect of this world long before we reached Toki. And contrary to her rules and restrictions, we have at least one confirmed example of backwards time travel in One Piece. Except it came with something quite strange that may inform us of the very nature of time in the One Piece universe. Something that people like me, obsessive men on the internet, need to learn to grapple with in regards to One Piece is that time is fundamentally different in this world. They use the same measurements as us, days, years, minutes, hours, the rest, but very rarely do those measurements make sense. For example, all of the following events that I am about to say happened in a single day. Luffy set out to sea, he met Kobe, defeated Alvida, met Zoro, recruited Zoro, got his head stuck in a bird, met Nami, kicked a clown in the balls, recruited Nami, met a man in a box, but not in the anime, that happens later, but in the manga it happens now, and then he met Usopp and we stayed up all night, and that is the very first night in One Piece. Everything that happened prior to Syrup Village, and even some of Syrup Village, happened within a single day. And for a more isolated example, there's the pretty notorious Dressrosa, as essentially an entire arc took place within a couple of hours. We arrived on the island in the morning, and by afternoon tea, Doflamingo had been defeated and the entire nation had been, well, it's not what it once was. Days are very, very long in the One Piece world. And so are the nights, which makes certain elements like Blackbeard allegedly being unable to sleep especially tragic, because as a child he would have had to spend extremely long periods of time all alone whilst everyone else was blissfully sleeping. Now, part of this may have to do with the size of the One Piece planet, which is it's a lot bigger than what I've got. The One Piece world is actually unbelievably colossal, and this is on purpose because when designing major islands, Oda gives himself a blank canvas of a very classical measurement of 1,000 ri wide and tall, meaning that almost every island in the series is the size of Australia, which if you look at it on a map, it's pretty damn big. Not a lot of it is livable, especially with all the deserts and the drop bears, but it is big nonetheless. And the world of One Piece is said to have tens of millions of islands. Just imagine that, tens of millions of Australias. You could only wish you were that lucky. And these are all based on measurements given by Oda himself, and I've got a whole video waiting here if you'd like to get into the detail of planet sizing, because there's a lot to digest. But for now, the point of this video is that time is weird. Time in the One Piece world does operate on our 24-hour system. Exact times are very rarely mentioned, but they do pop up now and then, and Oda has gone through and detailed how many hours of sleep the Straw Hats get per night. Most get between 5 to 8 hours, except for Zoro, who only gets 3, but that's the reason why he's always falling asleep throughout the day. But Oda using the word hours loses all meaning when we realize that we don't even know how long an hour in this world is. The times do not make sense, especially with travel distances. Sometimes it takes the equivalent of a week of sailing to complete the distance equivalent to circumnavigating our globe on a sailboat. Now, with that in mind, let's talk about direct time manipulation in the form of Kozuki Toki, previously known as Amatsuki Toki, who possesses the Toki Toki no Mi, the time fruit, which allows her to send herself or anyone she chooses a predetermined amount of time into the future, which Toki has rather thoroughly abused, as she was actually born during the Void Century and has used this devil fruit to jump all the way to 20 years ago. In Toki's case, this was because she was looking for Wano. Toki was not born there, but she knew that her parents were from there. However, she was very happy to put that to the side and sail with Kozuki Oden because, and I quote, "Just being around you makes me feel like I've already reached my destination." Very romantics. And we still don't know the full story behind Toki, and I'm looking forward to an eventual Toki flashback where we see her entire journey through 800 years of history. But what's more relevant for now is Toki's forward restriction, which is very interesting because despite the fact that she cannot travel back in time, Toki is a character who seems to innately understand what the future holds to a scarily accurate detail. Going back on Kozuki Oden's story, Toki shows a lot of emotion, but one emotion she never shows is surprise. There's never like a ah. When she falls ill, Toki makes sure that Oden continues with Roger to laugh tale. When Oden makes a deal for some Neki dancing, she tears up over Oden's pain, but she never asks him why he's doing it or suggests that he stops. And when Oden asks if Toki wants a divorce, she just laughs it off. When Orochi alters the deal with Oden, she watches him break breakdown, as if this was a moment she knew would always come. And when Yasu says that they need to be prepared for Odin to lose, Toki seems to understand Yasu's words better than he does. Nothing that happens ever surprises Toki, and she always seems to understand exactly what her role in these events is to be, which would be understandable if she could travel, back and forth in time. Having seen the future, she would know how to act, but apparently she can't do that because of magical fruit restrictions. And Toki's abilities could have changed a lot of things. For example, she could have sent Odin 20 years into the future, or even herself, instead of staying on Wano to die. But Toki did not do that, because she somehow seems to understand that everyone and everything has their exact purpose. In Odin's case, the people needed to hear his final message, which changed the opinion of the Flower Capital residents of the Kozuki clan, and may have helped prepare for the eventual opening of the borders of Wano for Joy Boy. And in Toki's case, it may have been extremely important for her to stay and die delivering the prophecy, because it installed paranoia within Kurozumi Orochi and influenced his actions over the next 20 years. You are the moon, unaware of the dawn. May your purpose be fulfilled, and cast 9 shadows on the night woven of 20 years, and you shall know the brilliance of dawn. The idea here is that Toki and Odin are weaving this ultimate night, so they need to stay to do said weaving. And also that this may have much greater meaning beyond simply Wano's salvation, that all of this is necessary for the eventual dawn of the world. Although I should say that in the manga, Toki's death is incredibly vague. It's implied that she died, and given that this is One Piece, implications of death are very hard to trust, and so I'm still waiting for the potential day when she rocks up 20 years into the future somewhere. But if you watch the anime, then she does look a lot more dead in that. And as alluded to before, there are a handful of other fictional fruits in the series that do manipulate time. Foxy's Noronoro is a prime example, slowing down anything touched by the Norima photons by 30 seconds, which notably is still not travel back in time. It's just slowing forward time progression for a bit. Alternatively, Shinobu's Juku Juku no Mi can also be considered a form of time manipulation, as it can speed up the age of objects or persons targeted, one of which was Momonosuke, thus making him the subject of 2 separate forms of time manipulation in the series after being sent 20 years into the future by Toki and having his body aged by 20 years by Shinobu. Again though, this is strictly forward manipulation, and Shinobu even issues a pretty stern warning that what she does cannot be undone. We cannot travel back into the time. The rules of devil fruits that dip into time are pretty consistent. Powers move forwards, not backwards, and even Princess Mansheri's Chiyu Chiyu fruit is effectively speeding up the healing and rebuilding process. It is not restoring people to health. And this is because Mansheri cannot create body parts if they're missing. Those body parts can be reattached, but she can't actually restore a body to how it once was if something is missing. And the reason for that is because she cannot travel backwards in time, only forwards, only speed up the healing process. And so backwards time travel or manipulation must be impossible, right? Well, that's what story lord Eiichiro Oda would have you think up until a certain point. But first, let's address the meta concern about being able to travel back in time, which would be that it simply creates too many narrative headaches. Toki's restriction of only being able to travel forward in time is extremely necessary, because if she could travel backwards, then it breaks the logic of why anything actually needed to happen. If Toki could go back and inform people of exactly what was coming, then there would be no Void Century, and we'd all be living happily ever after right now, except for us in the real world, because there would be no One Piece because nothing interesting is happening. But this decision also has quite a strong basis in real life. Traveling forward in time is actually something considered relatively easy by sciencemen on the planet, and it has been proven that the faster you travel, the slower time ticks for you. So there's a really cool experiment called the Hafel-Keating experiment, which loaded 2 planes chock full of atomic clocks and also kept 1 set of atomic clocks on the ground. And they had those 2 planes fly in opposite directions around the planet, one with the Earth's rotation and one against it. And what they found when those planes landed is that all of the clocks were different. One plane had experienced time faster, about 273 nanoseconds faster, whilst the other plane experienced time slower, about 59 nanoseconds slower than the clocks on the ground. I suppose proving that if you were to take the slower version of that to an extreme level, then you could put yourself in the position of experiencing time slower than a designated target, and therefore travel forward in time by removing yourself from the time it is that you want to travel forward into. If that makes sense, I think it does. However, what we cannot do is travel back in time. The options we have are to either experience time at a slower rate or a faster rate, but we can still only go forward. And there's actually a very prominent Elbathian theory that relates to this, which all has to do with the very sinister warning that we were given at the end of chapter 1132. Everything is breathtakingly huge. Adventurers do not regret your lost time here. However, if there is one message you take away from my account of the gigantic and mystical lands of Elbaf, let it be this word of warning: do not overstay your welcome here. That was the very sinister warning we were given by the word of Louis Arnaud, explorer from some time in the past. We don't know exactly when. But this has led to the wild theory that time operates differently on Elbaf than it does in the rest of the One Piece world. This is because of the specific warning of not regretting lost time, which could just be fanciful, florid language. But losing time is a very interesting idea because I feel like you're more likely to refer to it as spending time generally. We are spending time on Elbaf. It is a resource that we have dedicated to this adventure, and why would I regret spending time on this island? Whereas losing time, it implies that it has been stolen from us. Someone has thieved time from our time pockets. And so that implies something else entirely. And coupled with the final line about not staying too long, it has spawned the thought that time on Elbaf may move slower compared to the rest of the planet, and say that every hour on Elbaf is a day, week, or month in the One Piece world, which the giants don't notice because they live insanely long lives by default, and the rapid passage of time of humanity outside of their borders is quite natural to them. And we do actually have a potential example of this effect in action. This could be, and probably is, another completely innocent line, but in chapter 1076, Mr. Sir Shanks is seen on Elbaf and he says, "Think I spent a bit too much time talking," before deciding to set sail and defeat Eustace Kidd. But Kidd wasn't who Shanks was setting out to target originally. It was actually Bartolomeo, who had commandeered one of Shanks's New World islands. Now, what makes this strange is that Shanks declared that he was setting sail to defeat Bartolomeo and retake his territory on March 24th, which was the day that he did his Wano drive-by. But Shanks didn't actually arrive until after April 12th, which was after the Egghead incident, which is an awfully long time considering that Shanks is the man who traveled from his territory in the New World to Marineford in the first half of the Grand Line within the span of a couple of hours during the Paramount War. So why did it take Shanks 21 whole days to cover a significantly shorter distance? Well, that may be because there was one tricksy stop on that journey. Shanks went to the giant pub for a drink and caught up with Dory and Broggy, and by his own admission, he spent a bit too much time talking. Time that could have equated to weeks and given us this delay. Now, to be very, very clear, at the time of this recording, I think this idea is very much on the crackpot side of the spectrum. However, another thing it would explain is why we haven't cut to the outside world at all since reaching Elbaf. With our previous big arcs, Wano and Egghead Island, Oda was very conscious about showing us what was happening elsewhere in the world at regular intervals and constructing a very solid and meticulous timeline of events playing out in tandem with our main adventures. But there has been none of that on Elbaf so far. We are completely isolated, and it would be a pretty insane twist to leave this island and discover that we've had a whole second time skip happen in the outside world. But look, even if this crazy theory was true, all it does is add to the idea that time only moves forward. Sure, it can be slower in certain locations, but it can never move backwards, which is completely in line with the general themes of One Piece. It's all about moving on to the next generation, moving on to the next challenge by the Island Arc system and never going backwards, and even moving on to the next world and leaving this one behind, at least according to the prophecies of the Harley text. But there is one exception that breaks our time theory, because Toki and all of the others I said are not the only people with access to time manipulation, as Jewelry Bonnie has the Toshi Toshi no Mi, which roughly translates as the age fruit, although we know that age doesn't quite sum up the extent of its abilities. In a way, this fruit is very much the opposite of Toki's. Toki sent people into the future, so it moved time around them, or it moves them through time, whereas Bonnie inflicts time on the body of the target as well as herself whilst remaining in the present. And there is one extremely big difference here that breaks our entire theory of time, which is that Bonnie is capable of de-aging her targets. She can manipulate their bodies to move back in time, which is normally used to turn big scary marine men into pants-soiling crybabies. But regardless, with everything we know about the rules of time in One Piece, this should not be possible. This is blatant backwards time travel. But it is possible because in One Piece, anything that humanity can imagine just becomes very possible. And given that Bonnie's abilities are an inverse of Toki's, with one speeding up the environment around a target and one manipulating a target within the environment, does that mean that a direct opposite of Toki's Devil Fruit could exist? One which only allows its user to go back in time? Or if science were to advance far enough, could we unlock this idea without the need for fictional fruit? All I know is that at the very least, Bonnie has provided a point of evidence that this is not in fact impossible. Although one of the big secrets to Bonnie's abilities is that she can also dip into alternate realities, and this tends to manifest alternate futures, like the one where she's biologically a buccaneer, or more recently where she is the sun god Nika. And so I guess one way to potentially explain the de-aging is that Bonnie is creating younger alternate future versions. For example, when she de-aged Dr. Vegapunk, this was definitely an alternate Vegapunk because he still had the apple on his head, which his younger self in this world certainly would not have. And the idea here is that we have gone so far into the future that time has gone all cyclical. We've hit a repeating cycle, and Jewelry Bonnie isn't de-aging people. What she's doing is aging them so unbelievably far into the future that she's accessing alternate versions of them through different time cycles, thousands and thousands of years from where we are right now. Because that is another very tricky thing about One Piece. As much as all of the everything I've said is about pushing forward and never looking back, One Piece is ultimately kind of a quest to return to the past. We're trying to revive the old world that currently lay dormant beneath the great oceans of the planet. We're trying to reach the levels of technology that we once had 800 to 900 years ago, and we are trying to restore the planet back to its pre-Void Century state. Our future is the past, and our past is the future. If nothing else, Egghead Island definitely made that very clear. We spent all that time on the most advanced and most futuristic island we will ever set foot on, and the whole arc was thematically about returning to the past, and that what the future has in store for us could be found 800 to 900 years ago. And while time travel backwards may not be possible, it would appear that if you travel far enough into the future, then you are effectively going backwards, and this universe may very well be destined to play out the very same cycle of going from A to B, then back to A, then back to B, then back to A, and B again for all eternity.